pastoral and ministry leadership space, I think that the last year, 2020, with all that it entailed, from the pandemic to the politics to the social justice issues that were flying around to the great divisions and the stark contrasts that were created, the spaces where you couldn't say anything or do anything without getting a visceral response negatively from one side or the other. It really didn't matter where you stood. I think what that year did, especially in ministry leadership spaces, is it created this whole new level of emotional exhaustion because you are constantly navigating spaces to try to determine how to bring clarity and the gospel to spaces that were next to impossible to even navigate because of our societal context. And so I think what it did is it created a great deal of exhaustion, both physically and emotionally and spiritually and mentally for ministry leaders. I think that ministry exhaustion was already there. So think of it this way. You come into 2020 and you've kind of gotten used to what it feels like to be exhausted and tired. But you've managed coping mechanisms to just kind of keep functioning because it never quite tips the edge. And then this 2020 year happens, and it's like the straw that broke the camel's back, except it's a really big piece of straw. In other words, it takes already exhausted ministry leaders, because we know this is not a new thing, that ministry leaders are exhausted and live in secret spaces because they don't know who to tell for their, of their struggles, especially when they're small. Now 2020 creates a whole new level of exhaustion. And I would argue that we have not yet begun to see the real fallout from 2020 in the ministry leadership spaces. I think that the real fallout is going to come in the next 6 to 12 months when the ministry leaders that have been completely exhausted, spent no time on the inner life because of 2020 and before that, are going to crash and burn in larger numbers than we've probably ever seen come the next 6 to 12 months. So I think this topic should be written about, spoken about, sent out, blogged about in every possible category so that these ministry leaders can begin to put time into rest, time into recovery, time into soul care, and time into the inner life. This is the age-old reality that you get in your physical life. You have an option. You can either take the position to say, I want to go to the medical industry for preventive care. So I want to do things like eat healthier. I want to do things like exercise. I want to do things like go see a doctor once a year and get a physical, so that I prevent things before they're so serious that they're now damaging and dangerous. Or you can take the course of action that says, I'm just going to live life any way I want. And at some point when it gets really bad and I literally can't function, I'll go see a doctor. But oftentimes by then, the recovery's massive or the damage is so bad that there's very little possibility for full recovery. In ministry leadership life, we would say the same thing. We put no time or very little time into caring for our souls well, the inner life, the intimacies that we have. And then when it does crash and burn, it crashes and burns big. So I would say ministry leaders now will not recognize how exhausted they are because they're so used to being exhausted. But this is a different level of exhaustion. And I would say, as you said, time is running out. If we want to be preventive, we need to do healing stuff in the next 6 to 12 months. Otherwise, burnout is coming. And healing stuff takes time, energy, resources, and means you're not going to be able to do as much work. So that's troubling. That's why people don't take the time to do it. But we have to. Otherwise, the end result is going to be a giant crash and burn. I think the beginning is just to recognize and to acknowledge that there is a reality of exhaustion and a reality of soul depletion that has taken place, and to acknowledge that to the people in your inner circle, your elders, your ministry, the leaders in your church, if you're in a nonprofit, the board, whatever it might be, to have the courage to say, hey, everybody, I think I'm more tired and more exhausted than I've ever been. I recognize that and I acknowledge that. I think that's the starting point. Us ministry leaders, we have this, typically sort of Messiah complex that we say we don't, but it sort of lingers, sometimes big, sometimes small. And we're just like, man, We just martyr ourselves for the sake of the people. Trouble is, you end up actually doing more damage in the long run because you will burn out. We are not gods, we are men and women, and we cannot carry the load of being godlike. And that's what we do in ministry a lot. So I would say it's starting by simply acknowledging and recognizing that there is a need for rest and recovery. And then the second step would be taking the action and paying the price to actually go do the rest and recovery. This is not a week-long vacation. This is a big journey. At the church that I'm a part of, that I get to pastor, in November of this last year, end of 2020, we had a group come in, an outside group, and they did a full evaluation on our leadership structure and leadership health. And in January, we got a report from them, long report about all the upsides and the deficits that they found. And then we sat together as a leadership team and we determined for myself as lead pastor and for our teams, different sabbaticals and breaks and intensives that we needed to do to recover from 2020 and before that, and to build new leadership skills in this new world. So actually, as I speak with you even now, I am in the middle of a 3-month sabbatical. It's the worst possible time to take that from the church because the church needs me more than ever. And yet it is the only time to take it, because if I don't, a year from now, I won't even be around for the church. So we have to be willing to pay the price in the immediacy for the long haul well-being of both our own souls and the well-being of the church and the gospel. This, especially because of 2020, and I would argue even if 2020 didn't happen, it would still be an urgency, but 2020 has certainly amplified that urgency. This is not a topic or an issue that is sort of like a, hey, if you happen to have time, pay some attention to this. This is going to make the difference between a massive fallout in ministry leadership in the next 1 to 5 years, or a regrouping toward great health and great well-being in the areas of ministry, which will ultimately show the world either that the church is just as big of a mess as they think it is, or that the church is in fact an incredibly powerful display of God and his love and his redemption toward mankind. And it starts with us ministry leaders taking the time to do what we preach to our congregations to do, which is to spend time working on the inner life, the intimacies with God, spouse, and biblical community, and making sure that we are healthy in those spaces.